There are lots of you here today, and thanks so much for joining me and Kelby. We are big fans of TTRA and just want to say thanks for giving us the opportunity to share our point of view on data and how to use it in tourism. Thanks to all of you for joining. We designed today's presentation really with you in mind, as you are typically the data navigators for your organization. And we know that it's sometimes hard to get others in the organization to understand the things you understand. I'm Lauren. I've had the pleasure of working with many of you, and I've had the pleasure of hanging with many of you in St. Louis and Houston this past year. I'm joined today by our founder at Datafy, Kelby, who I'm so lucky to call my kind of coworker, kind of boss, kind of genius guy that I just get to learn from every day. We wanted to start this conversation off with our new headshots that have been designed by our children. Kelby, I think Genevieve is spot on of her visualization. And I think my kid thinks that I am evil Princess Peach. So there you go. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? Let me switch over here. I've got two screens going, so bear with me. We are first going to give everybody updates on what's going on in big data and how things are different today than it was 2 years ago, and how they might be different in the future. Next, we want to equip you with some of the ways to simply talk about big data with your coworkers and give some examples that might actually help them be able to talk about it as well. And last up, we want to give you examples on how data can be used across your organization. We're going to share a bunch of examples from different destinations and how they've put data to use. And at the end, we're going to take questions. Anything you want to ask, we will happily take a look and answer and give you our best response. So our goal today is for everyone to feel informed about big data, have ways to help others in your organization talk about big data, and get some ideas flowing. Also, everyone probably already knows this, but there's going to be an emergency, a nationwide emergency alert, probably in the middle of while Kelby is talking. So if you get scared and jump out of your seat, there's no judgment here. We're the ones on camera, so I might be startled and it might be very embarrassing. All right, so over with that, I'm gonna send it over to Kelby.
Awesome. And just as we get started, I apologize if my voice cracks. I picked up that fall cold going around. But if you have questions along the way, please add them in the Q&A, as Mike mentioned in the chat. We will keep an eye on those and try and get through as many at the end as we can. But please use the Q&A function there at the bottom of the screen. All right. Actually, can you take us back one slide?
Sorry, I'm going between screens messing up. Sorry.
No worries. So a couple updates just from big data, and in particular how it relates to some of the data feeds that we pull in with travel and tourism. One of the big things to just kind of touch base on is just overall sample sizes are back to what we saw in some of the pre-pandemic levels. Now, some of you might be saying, well, if familiar with geolocation, like, well, the sample size never left. Well, the way that we look at sample size might be a little bit different than others, where we're looking at overall representativeness, the quality and the cleanliness of the data sample, and are ultimately looking at how much coverage is there of the sample relative to the overall population of folks that like to travel. So looking at that more holistic view, that's what we're saying, we're back to what we saw in some of the pre-pandemic levels. And luckily and thankfully, we're some of the volatility that we and others experienced and saw in 2022 is now in the rearview mirror. Now, while some of that volatility and the sample sizes are back, the overall panel is different. And that's where I want to talk a little bit about foreground and background data as it relates to geolocation. So just as a quick overview, when we say background data, what we mean is it doesn't matter if the user's actually interacting with that application. So that means that just by having an application installed on a user's phone, they could be walking around a grocery store with their phone in their purse or their pocket. But every couple of minutes, depending on the app, maybe every couple of hours, there's this background ping where that app will phone home, more or less, and it will record its location every couple of minutes. And that's regardless of what the user's actually doing on their phone at the time or not doing on their phone. So that's background data. The foreground data means the user has to be physically interacting with the application for that application to record an event or record a location event. And so some years ago, and for a long time, the vast majority of the data that was available through third-party sharing from applications was background data. That was default by most applications. We're in the midst of a shift where more and more are now becoming foreground only, or more foreground heavy than background heavy. And this is through a variety of policy changes by Google and Apple, as well as some user choice options that have been enabled. But you can think about it as background provides a very homogeneous, very ubiquitous type of panel behavior, where every user on a particular application is behaving in the same way in terms of the way that data is getting reported up. But now with some of the more nuances, now we have a bifurcated or a much more diverse type of a panel where some are foreground, some are background, and then layering on privacy, it gets even more complicated. So with some of the changes that Apple in particular has made, where there's now more pop-ups, more user in-your-face type of choice, as well as default settings that disable location sharing. But one of the things that's happened with some of those changes in privacy is now users are given a choice and often funneled into choosing not to share their location. Or if they are, there's choices such as share all the time, share only while using the app. So that's that foreground versus background, or not at all. And then the other thing is a choice between coarse and precise data. And so what precise means is that we can pinpoint with very good accuracy where that user is within your destination. Coarse means that location is going to be obfuscated by some degree. It could be up to a half a mile or so. Now, for certain types of analyses, coarse location is perfectly fine. If you're trying to look to see kind of who's in the downtown, that half mile or so of precision is more than enough in most cases. But if you're trying to determine who went to Hotel A versus who went to Hotel B on the other side of the block, half mile precision from a coarse report is not going to cut it. And so overall, what's happening is that because of this difference in user choice, the panel, you can have the same app installed on 100 people's phones. Some of those phones are precise background. Some of those users are going to be precise foreground. Some are not at all. Some are background coarse. And so it has meant that the overall panel, instead of being able to just normalize and assume we have this very homogeneous behaving panel, we have to control for all the different nuances that are enabled because of this background and foreground shift, as well as privacy. And it's something where we've been working painstakingly on our normalization and our modeling we feel very confident in our year-over-year comparisons, because we are controlling and measuring and tracking all of these different types of changes across the industry. But one of the things, you can go ahead, next slide, Lauren. One of the things that this type of nuance, I think, should help us kind of change the conversation a little bit with our stakeholders and be able to embrace some of this nuance. And so one of the types of data streams that you're all probably very familiar with would be intercept surveys. These surveys are excellent at helping to understand where people are from, what was the purpose of their travel. And there's a lot of questions that can be answered from a type of survey. There are very similar types of questions that can be answered from geolocation, such as what's your origination market? How long are you in destination? And there's lots of questions that can be answered that kind of fall in that same category of a sample being representative of a population of visitors. There are other types of questions that can be asked to geolocation data, and we love working in this realm as well, but it's a little bit more complicated than some of the audience makeup. And I think a better comparison might be weather data. So you're all very familiar with weather forecasts. Weather forecasters are really good at certain things, such as what is the estimated temperature on a given day? Is it going to be cloudy or is it going to be sunny? There are types of questions that they hit really, really consistently. But there's other questions such as, is this upcoming storm going to drop a half an inch of rain? Or is this upcoming storm going to drop 1.5 inches of rain? Or is it going to be a drizzle? And so those are the types of questions that even weather prediction has more volatility on, because it's a much more complicated question than what is the estimated top high temperature for the day. So when we start talking about geolocation, I think we need to have more nuanced discussion around what type of question is being answered, and does it fall into the category of layup shot, or does it fall into the category of weather prediction? And maybe as an example, we'll kind of go through one more to kind of elaborate on this a little bit more. There's a party game that I'm sure you've all played at some point in your life, which is the classic gumball guessing game. You walk into the party expecting to have a good time, and all of a sudden someone hands you a piece of paper and says, guess how many gumballs are in this machine. That's one type of question they might ask. Another type of question is, what is the makeup of that gumball machine? So in other words, what percentage of the gumballs are blue versus what percentage of the gumballs are yellow versus what percentage might be red? So there are two very different types of questions that you might get asked in this gumball game. If you were asked, what is the percentage of blues in this gumball machine? One of the best ways of getting a really good estimate would be to pull out, say, 50 gumballs randomly. And of that 50 gumballs that you pulled out, how many were blue, how many were red, how many were yellow, etc. And assuming you were able to pull out a random sample, with high precision, you could come up with an estimate of how many were blue, say 80% blue, 5% yellow, etc. Statistics will very standard statistics type of questions you could answer there. And pulling out that random sample can get you to the answer to that question. And so for a DMO, maybe blues would represent your locals. And maybe the red gumballs represent people that are from 50 to 100 miles away. And then maybe yellows are those really sought after tourists that are going to stay for a week. And so knowing what is the overall makeup on any given day or over any given period of time of locals, visitors, high net worth visitors, those types of questions can be answered really well from that sampling. But now let's say the question is, how many gumballs are in that gumball machine? Pulling out 10 gumballs and looking to see how many are blue and how many of that sample was red does not directly tell you much about how many are in there. That's a very different math problem. And so when you're trying to estimate how many people might be in there, you would look to see, okay, how big do I think that bowl is? What's the approximate volume? What's the volume of each gumball? What's the dead space or amount of air between the gumballs and how much space at the top? So it'd be very different types of context that you'd be looking for and ultimately calculating to come up with an estimate of overall volume. And the same thing is true with volume estimates for geolocation. But the important part to understand is one being accurate does not guarantee that the other is accurate, or one being incorrect does not guarantee that the other is incorrect. There are two very different types of questions that are being asked. And I think one of the tendencies that we have as humans is to quickly throw out data or quickly throw out an option if it doesn't immediately confirm a bias we might have about the question that we're asking. But one of the things with geolocation, especially in this new era of a very diverse type of a panel, is to help stakeholders understand what type of question are we asking and what is our confidence in the answer relative to what the method was and the type of observation that we have. So when we're doing geolocation estimates for overall volume, we are not just looking at how many blues did we pull out and how many yellows we pull out. There are many, 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 many factors that we're looking at to be able to determine and come up with a good prediction that we're confident in of what is the volume of visitors on a given day, or what is the volume of visitors at a venue. But it's a much different question than the sampling. One other nuance is, there's the old from, I believe it was Secretary Rumsfeld some years ago, had the famous quote of saying there are known knowns, there are unknown unknowns, or the known knowns, known unknowns, and then unknown unknowns. And there is the alert.
It scared me.
So I'll give everybody a minute, and your phones might take a minute to silence those alerts. Okay, so basically when we're looking at prediction of volume, there are things that we may not be aware of under the surface. And so there might be two events that look very similar from a high level view. But then go ahead, Lauren, you can advance it. There are scenarios where only a local person would be able to understand that while these two events might look the same, these gumball machines actually have a fake facade, and there's some type of a bottleneck or some type of a circumstance, an unknown variable that throws our volume prediction for a loop. And so that's where we might be off, or whomever you're working with can be off on a volume estimate, but that does not mean that the overall makeup of the composition of the sample is automatically also incorrect. Because there's two very different questions, and there's variables that can throw one off that will have minimal, if any, impact on the other types of questions that may be asked. And so, as we're talking about not just geolocation, but this could be spending data or lodging data, no matter what type of data you're looking at to try and inform and better understand your visitors, having this nuanced view of what type of question are we asking, and what are the types of questions, and what is the different type of math that's being used on that same data set. And having that more nuanced view, I think, will help create more confidence in stakeholders, so that as different data point, if different data sources might present or might suggest a more nuanced view of the same type of question, we can embrace the strengths of different data streams to come up with an overall point of view on tourism travel. So we'll talking about more of this in some specifics about how we navigate these types of things. But in general, that's where we see we're very confident in the overall health of the geolocation market. We think it's kind of entering a new steady state, where some of the changes that Apple and Google have made are now kind of filtered through. And what we see is kind of a new dynamic, but it will mean there are some questions we used to ask in the past that may not be the best questions to answer with geolocation data alone. But there's still lots of really valuable data and lots of really valuable analysis can be enabled through geolocation.
Kelby, would you argue that geolocation has become commoditized at this point?
Yes, thank you so much. So I think for a long time there was almost an arms race amongst us and competitors saying, well, we've got more in our sample, we've got more in our panel. Those days I'm confident are largely behind us, because the panel has become so commoditized. And like they used to say, all roads lead back to Rome. All of us are trying to get back to the same users. And ultimately, it's in an app's best interest most of the time to sell, that aggregated data to as many people as they can. And it's created this where the feeds and the panels, there are some nuances from one to another. But our competitors use great data, and ours are, we're all sourcing a lot of the same types of feeds. And ultimately, it becomes, what do you do with that data? How do you filter it? How do you normalize it? How do you model with it? And those, I think, are the really things that have set us apart, because the data has largely become commoditized.
Thank you, Kelby. Sorry, everyone, that I keep skipping back and forth. Every time I click to my other screen, I skip a slide. If anybody on the call wants to learn more about really like the nitty gritty sort of technical back end type of data stuff, you can always reach out to us. And if you'd like to know more about how big data works with other types of research, we are participating in a really groundbreaking project with subject matter experts like Kelby. TTRA International Board member Dr. Whitney Nullenberg at North Carolina State University is creating the DMO Toolkit project. So it's going to be a series of white papers bringing together collaborative vendors and practitioners across the industry, for everyone to understand how different data sources can be used and used together. And so at Datafy, we're lending Kelby's expertise in big data to how it is processed to be meaningful. It's painting a clear picture of strengths and limitations of different sources. So we are really excited to participate in this project through North Carolina State University. Okay, so now we're going to start getting a little bit more into use case examples of how to use big data. I am going to just start over here. Okay, cool. So I think geolocation for destination marketing is probably the most obvious. I came from the DMO world, right? Like we did our annual visitor profile, and we would know that, our top visitors came from New York and Chicago and Texas or whatever, right? I think one of the best things geolocation can do, though, is really sort of get into the more nuanced views of who is coming when. So when do the New Yorkers come versus the Texans versus the Floridians, right? How do we start to understand a little bit more about different origin markets so that we can get really efficient with our marketing plan? The second thing is really, I think, around ad hoc events. More and more, we're trying to, think of new things that will draw visitors to need periods throughout the year. So actually, we have a client that I met with last week from Golden, Colorado, and they have the Golden Retriever Festival, which I thought was the cutest thing I've ever heard of. But how do you start to think of these things that can be unique experiences within your destination? And with that, how do we figure out, who is the potential audience for this? How do we think about what can we learn when we get a first time event so that we can decide if we want it to come back or not? And then I think the last part is really around audience development, sort of back to the who is coming when. I think traditionally there's just been a lot of sort of holistic evergreen planning where you say these are our top markets and we just market to them year round, or we stop during off season. But if we can really understand our feeder markets a little bit more in depth in terms of their length of stay, how much they're spending, when are they coming, these types of insights can really help us become more efficient overall as marketers. So here are two examples. The first one is Visit Charlevoix. This one's near and dear to my heart. I'm from Michigan originally, and my family used to go up north, as we call it, every summer. And Charlevoix during the summertime is hopping. There's people all over the place. There's fun little concerts in the park. There's people around boats. And some people, to be honest, it's busy enough to the point that some people I think get priced out. They go to check and it's just, there's enough demand that sometimes there's nowhere to go. So the DMO is really trying to think of how can we promote the destination other times of year so that either the summer visitors can come back in winter, or they can think about planning their vacations in the future. Sorry, I'm trying to look at the picture. So that right there is the lighthouse in Charlevoix, which normally you'd picture in your mind the beach, right? So we served up this creative using the data to audiences who were past summer visitors with winter creative to try to encourage them to come back and experience a completely different side of the destination. So really at the end of the day, the idea is how do we shift that summer visitor to create demand for winter when things aren't as busy? Okay, another place near and dear to my heart, Carlsbad, California. That's where I live. In Carlsbad, we have luxury resorts that have golf courses and spas attached to them. And we've got Legoland and a lot of limited service hotels. The destination really wanted to think about how can we start to segment those two audiences, because obviously the people staying at $500 a night, resorts is very different than family vacations to Legoland. There is some crossover between the two, but largely two sort of separate audiences. So we started to think about, who are the visitors that are going to end up at the resorts, and really thought about how people behave. And if visitors have been going to resorts in other coastal Southern California destinations, that might be a really good audience to try to encourage to come to the resorts in Carlsbad. On the flip side, for the family travelers that were sort of staying in the limited service hotels, how could we capitalize on serving up creative around Legoland to people that had visited other attractions in Southern California? So the whole idea of really looking at the data to think of an audience that is most likely to convert in terms of a travel audience for each of the segments that we're looking at based on past behavior. All right, so Kelby, my question for you is, from a media planning standpoint, why does using data-backed audiences make for a more efficient and responsible advertising spend?
Yeah, so there's the ad tech space is really interesting. And a lot of the optimization that's occurred with campaign optimization in real time. So think about Facebook. If you're running a Facebook campaign, there's this, if you've run those, you kind of, there's this sweet spot where it'll take a little while for the kind of the algorithm to figure out your audience. And then normally it kind of dials in like a segment of the audience, and then we'll start focusing on them. And so then normally it's typical to see this type of kind of slow behavior, and you'll see maybe a surge in clicks or a surge in some type of activity. So speaking generally, most of the developments that have been in the ad technology space have been around optimizing audiences in real time. And so it's, think about Google's pay-per-click, they're looking to see who's likely to engage in a particular activity. And if they can start to identify similarities between, across the users, that, oh, this type of a user is going to click, or this type of a user is going to convert, they will optimize those campaigns in real time to try and narrow in. But here's the challenge with travel and tourism. Those have largely been driven by impulse type buying. So, if I'm selling toasters, I want someone who's going to buy a toaster today. And I want that algorithm to quickly find those people that want a toaster today, so they can click out, they can check out, and I can gain an ROI on my investment. But what has lagged behind in the industry is that type of optimization towards long conversion windows. So if my conversion might take weeks of vacation planning, most of the developments in Facebook and Google and others around real-time optimizations, they may optimize towards people that are clicking, people that have kind of an eye candy type view towards travel, an aspirational view, but they may optimize towards the wrong type of people who are actually going to visit your community. And so that's where there's kind of been a gap and a lag in the ad tech space, where creating audiences based around, as Lauren was saying, based around an observed behavior in market. There's been a bunch of research that we sift through and look through, suggesting that repeat visitors, they spend more money, they make more economic impact for your destination often than first-time visitors. And so getting re-engagement from an audience that is familiar with your destination is oftentimes less expensive, but they create more impact than trying to get someone who's never been to your community before. And so building audiences around what we call responsible audiences, or high conversion audiences that are specifically designed for travel and tourism is a little bit different, in some cases very different, than the impulse type buying that a lot of different DSPs, a lot of different ad tech companies optimize towards.
Cool, thanks. All right, so now we're going to go over to geolocation for destination development. This obviously, destination development can mean a lot of different things to different people. It can mean product development. It can be moving people around the destination to areas that are undervisited. It can be looking at sort of, impact on local versus visitors and how either of those are using the destination. So there's a lot of different use cases for geolocation and destination development. And I think really one of the things is to almost back out into, hey, what are we doing? And how can we look for data points that support this or can help bring intelligence to our point of view? So we've got two examples here. The first one is from Emporia, Kansas. For those of you who don't know, Emporia, Kansas has more disc golf courses than a lot of places. I always say, like, it's the disc golf capital of the universe, because once Leland, their executive director, told me that's what they have there, I have to like turn it into hyperbole. But they really do. They have a lot of, it's a small town, lots of disc golf courses, and that's obviously a niche audience, but there are people who travel to do that. And so Emporia really had limited marketing budget, but really wanted to kind of figure out how to capitalize on the fact that they have this product and start to promote it. Because they had limited budget, they really needed to seek out sponsors to try to help build out the promotional materials. So they created a disc golf guide. They started putting little disc golf putter sort of test areas around some of the certain hotels. And they really used the geolocation to kind of figure out, hey, where are areas of critical mass where we can put this so that a sponsor is going to pay us money to put their signage there and really help offset the cost of this overall initiative that we want to go in and do. And so the data really supported the value of the sponsorship to partners and helped assess where sponsors would be featured on signage throughout the town. And then we've got Kanab over here. And so Kanab, Utah is right in the middle of several major national park attractions. Data was showing us that one of the areas really hadn't quite recovered to pre-COVID levels, whereas other areas were really starting to almost be over-touristed or were really booming. So we started to look at the correlation between where lodging was and what people were visiting. And we could tell from that data point too that there just wasn't as much correlation between lodging and the area that sort of hadn't recovered. And so really the goal would be with that is to sort of build brand awareness around the areas that are less visited by serving ads to past visitors and potential visitors to places that are overcrowded during peak times. So with destination development in mind, the goal is increasing visitation to one attraction, bringing more economic impact holistically, but also trying to sort of shift some of the visitation to areas that aren't as visited and away from those that are. Okay, so Kelby, here's my question on this one. How does geolocation data collection vary across venue types? And follow up to that is, how do you build audiences and measure success using geolocation against different venue types?
Yeah. So this kind of comes back to some of the stuff we were talking earlier around the difference in foreground and background. So the probability of picking someone up, say for instance, when they're playing disc golf, is different than if they're at an overlook where they're going to want to take these big picturesque pictures to share with all their friends versus they're highly engaged and they're not going to be playing on their phone during a disc golf event. So there's a lot of subtle differences like that we have to control for to gauge whether or not was there really net lift at a venue pre or post campaign. So in terms of measuring success, it's not something we can say, well, we saw 100 devices before and now we see 115 devices, so it's you had a net lift. Or when you're comparing, did this one work in location A versus did this one work in location B? So when we're looking at these types of comparisons, we run it through all sorts of different modeling to be able to account for differences in venue type, differences in the type of behavior that's going to occur at that venue, so that when we are trying to gauge and report on success of one initiative versus another, if those initiatives are at different venues or different types of experiences, we can still have an informed discussion with stakeholders around relative impact, even though the underlying data may have come from very different samples. So it comes back to trying to understand all the different variables that are feeding into the underlying data, and then controlling for those before we make too many assumptions around whether or not something had an impact or not.
Awesome. Right. Okay, so geolocation for events and conventions. I got to be honest, when I started first working here 3 years ago, I was very excited about this stuff because it was just something that we kind of thought 2 years ago would solve all of our DMO problems. I mean, I was a polygoning fool. I was geofencing donut shops and bait shops and whatever clients wanted. But really what might have gotten to, what we might have been able to get to a few years ago at a small event over a short window, it's just not the case anymore. Today, it's a lot more challenging. That being said, there's still a lot of use for geolocation in events. Hold on, guys. I need to cough real quick. Thanks. So, I think that back to Kelby's gumball analogy in the beginning, right? Attendee origin markets for events are still really stable. So when we have an estimate that doesn't line up to sort of what we expected or to ticketing data, it doesn't mean we need to throw the origin market data out, whether that's local versus visitor, or whether that's in-state, out-of-state, whether it's people outside of a certain mileage, right? And so I think that those are the types of things that we can sort of still reliably use for events and conventions. To Kelby's point, estimates are a little more sticky. I think he'll elaborate on that when we have the follow-up question. But if you've got a big event and you've got an accurate footprint and people are likely to be on the phone, we still have a chance to get really close with our estimates, right? So it's very different when we're saying, hey, here's an estimate for a county in a month versus here's an estimate for a roller skating rink on a Tuesday. And so, no, we can't tell you how many people went to your kid's birthday party, right? That's also where it starts to get into sort of, privacy issues. The other thing is that, data can be used with other data, right? So if you have truth point data, like ticketing data, particularly, right, these things can kind of come together to paint a bigger picture on, an event's impact on the destination. Okay, so I'm going to show an example from my friend Steve at Travel Portland. So Steve, well, first of all, Portland is home to the Rose Festival, right? It's a 3-weekend event that takes place starting Memorial Day weekend. There's several components, right? There's a fair, there's a parade, and the organizers basically told Steve and the team at Travel Portland that there were 680,000 people at the event, right? And so, we had you can kind of see how this goes from whatever an event organizer's cartoon image of an area to, a polygon and trying to figure out device behavior within it. These two things don't always line up, right? So you really got to kind of think through, where did this thing take place behaviorally? Where were people? Where would they have been parked, right? There's a lot of things we can kind of think about to try to really grab the right sort of area for this type of analysis. At the end of the day, we didn't come up with 680,000. We came up with around 50,000. When Steve was able to get sort of the truth point data, which were the actual ticket sales, it ended up that there were about 30,000 ticket sales for this actual fair, and all of that other 600,000 or so visitor counts were from the parade that was in a completely different polygon or area that was geofenced, right? So my point being is when we're doing this type of analysis, you really got to think through, one, do we have the right area covered? Two, just because someone's throwing out a crazy number doesn't mean that that's what it is either, which I think a lot of us run into. And this all really sort of merits a thoughtful approach to go through it and really think it through. I think at the end, we were able to determine that 32% of visitors or devices were from outside of 50 miles. We could see which DMAs were showing up weekend over weekend, and if any of them were fly market, and really tried to give the DMO a little more insight on, hey, this is sort of the composition of the visitors that show up to these types of events in Portland. That can be used in tandem with the truth data, because using geolocation for attendance numbers is obviously an estimate based off of what Kelby just shared, not, a truth point. So with that, Kelby, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about how our team kind of leaned into the estimates versus what was our estimates, and how we came up with that versus what was getting communicated by the event organizer.
Yeah, so this is one where the event organizers were saying, no, there were 680,000 people. And so they're like, when our estimate was significantly less than that, there was, certainly some tension around, well, who's off? And certainly we try and be humble enough to accept that, there could be things that we've done in our analysis that's incorrect. But ultimately we confirmed, you're talking about just the parade, just the fair, right? You're not talking about the parade. Nope, not the parade. They were saying there were 680,000 people at just the fair part of it. So in this case, we did a bunch of different, log level detail, looking at movement patterns, pre and post processing through our cleaning and algorithms and all that, and kept coming back with, no, we think there were right around 50,000 people here. There's, we're an order of magnitude less than what they're reporting. And we started doing some other checks where we did a little bit of additional digging, looking for additional information around the event. Where do people park? What is the actual footprint of the fair? And with that information, we're able to determine, there's just no possible way that you could have fit that many people in this size of a footprint. And so with that information, with some feedback, then that's when the event organizers said, oh, you know what, we were giving you the numbers from the parade. We actually have tickets and this was the number of tickets, and that ended up being, much closer to our estimate than what was initially thought. So I think in some cases, being willing to dive a little deeper, and our team not stopping at the surface level, but diving and diving and diving, gave them the confidence to go back to the organizers and say, we think there's, we think we need to have a more nuanced discussion here, which is then what ultimately ended up with the discovery of the ticketed information that had that point of truth that aligned with our estimates. So I think the moral of the story here was just really diving deep and making sure we had left no stone unturned as we were generating our estimates.
Yeah, and I think it's like, having, a researcher or whoever the point person at the DMO to sit down and get context and really think through, like, what did this look like in the human form? Because we're not there, obviously, right? And so we're looking at things that are modeled without context. So when we can have that conversation one-on-one, I think we can also get a lot further with a point of view. Okay, I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to kind of scoot through these. But just in terms of using geolocation for public relations, community relations, look, I think we're all trying to constantly communicate the value of our work so we can keep up with our fundings, our jobs. And data can be really useful in supporting a narrative. So a lot of times I think it's starting with the question you're trying to answer or a statement that you're trying to make, and then digging up the data points to help, or multiple data points really, to have sort of a holistic point of view on what you're trying to say. I think oftentimes DMOs get requests for things that they don't really know how to handle because you just don't really, it's not something maybe you had a data point for or didn't have to think about in the past. Like for example, how did weather events impact visitation, right? So I think when your PR team gets a press question, just stopping to think, do we have any data that can help provide a point of view so that the DMO has authority as the destination expert? This is just an example of from Quad Cities. They're kind of bringing everybody together in the region to talk about, how they're moving forward, and used a couple of data points to sort of support where they're going. Okay, the last one's just geolocation for reporting at an executive level. So I think there's a few things that, can be used, right? Do you have a destination performance monthly report, quarterly report? Do you have something that can kind of provide a point of view on where are people coming from? Are markets growing share, losing share, et cetera? The second one would just be kind of being able to look at different timeframes. Like maybe you're at a destination that has a lot more seasonality and monthly doesn't matter, but May to October does. Just having the flexibility to sort of provide a snapshot of a particular season. And then the last one is just basically ad hoc requests. I mean, I know when I was at the DMO, I used to get crazy questions that I'm like, this is not my job. But can we help you put a point of view on it, even though it's not your job, right? Like it's not something you have to think about day to day. Weird question, but we have the log level granularity to go and look at it. So is there something we can kind of explore together? And so I'm just going to kind of show you a couple of quick examples. We've got the state of Colorado. They have a lot of smaller communities that don't really have the resources to have research, people or reports or anything on their own. So they provide executive summaries to each of those smaller communities during their stakeholder meetings so that they can be a resource to those smaller communities. And then the second example here is Black Hills and the Badlands. Black Hills is a big regional DMO. You can kind of see in these two ads that one is Best Western and one is Devil's Tower. And so basically, how can they optimize with their stakeholders to really amplify campaigns promoting the smaller businesses within the destination, but to appropriate audiences that are actually going to convert into visitation? And so I think, Kelby, I've got two sort of last questions for you. One is, what types of data are most relevant to stakeholders and can bring confidence? Because I think that's one of the things is, you sit there at the DMO and you say, I've got this, and then you bring it to a stakeholder board chair, whoever, right? And the first thing a lot of times people want to do is sort of challenge that, right? And so what do you think are the most relevant types for this sort of information sharing that will bring confidence to the stakeholders?
Yeah. So I think that the biggest thing is taking a step back to say, what is the best source of data to answer the particular question at hand? And so if the question is something like, was this event mostly visited by locals or visitors? Geolocation data, we have a high level of confidence in that type of analysis, if that's the question at hand. If the question at hand is, well, how many people walked through the gate of the county fair, and we believe there's, geolocation can provide an estimate. We believe we can, we're the best in the business in generating those estimates, but at the end of the day, it's still an estimate. And if that is the most important question, then we think you should find some other source of data, which ideally would be, ticket sales. So if there's, I think it's a matter of sometimes when we find one tool, we want to use it across every question. But taking a step back and saying, is this the right tool or is this the right data stream to answer this particular question? If it's a lodging question, a direct source that's generated from lodging is going to be your best bet. If it's ticket sales, then a point of sale or a ticket, ticket counter is going to be your best bet. But if it's overall, broader points of view, or some of those other sources aren't available, then geolocation can be a great point of view. So I think it's really kind of stepping back and asking, what is the question? Maybe it's the question behind the question. And then do I have a direct source that can answer that ultimate question that my stakeholders are asking? And if so, our recommendation is always, let's use the best source of data for the particular question that's at hand.
Okay, here's the last question, and then we're going to go to Q&A. So if people want to start putting questions in, go right ahead. Okay, so Kelby, last question. What do you think is the most important big picture piece of advice for people on this call when it comes to data?
Yeah. So this is one where I think we would do well to, what was the phrase? Become comfortable being uncomfortable. And in the area that we live in, there's an abundance of data. And it's really easy to get so much data that you start to see conflicting points of view that are coming off of the exact same data stream. So data can suggest one thing, but it can also suggest something else. And I think the natural tendency when that happens is to discredit or throw it out the window and go somewhere else. But because we're in this era of more and more and more data, there will always be more data that we haven't even thought of yet that may become available for researchers, down the road. And being able to embrace multiple points of view simultaneously while we continue to search, while we continue to try and find an answer, because there might be another point of view that comes in with another data stream that then corroborates, and then things open up. But I think we would do well to not be too premature in eliminating a particular point of view or a particular course of action. So maybe it's when you're determining where to place marketing dollars, not eliminating a course of action prematurely, but being able to embrace a little bit of that tension, embrace a little bit of that uncertainty as we continue to research, and then gather more information that corroborates, and then a clear path opens up, and then follow that path.
Great. All right. Well, we have a question in the Q&A from the one and only Anna Blunt from Longwoods. She says, looking at resident sentiment towards tourism and how increasingly important local voices are to destination strategic planning, could you compare the share of residents attending a given event or going to what would be considered tourist location versus visitors? Yes. The idea being demonstrating these events and places are not just tourist in nature. Any other ideas on how geolocation data can be used to help in this area? Do you want me to answer, or do you want to answer?
Yeah, you can start, and I'll jump into.
The answer is yes, as long as the sample is solid enough, right? So, donut shop on a Tuesday, and there's 3 locals and 1 visitor, probably not. Birthday party at the roller rink with my daughter's kindergarten class? Probably not. Uh, Poetry night with 50 people, maybe not, right? Depends on if people are on their phones or not, right? And so the answer is, when we're looking at something significant, yeah, for sure. If we're looking at a given day and a destination, absolutely. But we really just still have to put into context for size of area, geofenced, behavior of people. Anything to
Yeah,
add?
the only thing I'll add to that is through many studies, our system, we've determined that locals and visitors behave differently, and we have to treat them differently in our modeling. We have to treat them differently in our analysis because they behave differently. There's different usage patterns, and so if you're in a think about it this way: if you're not knowing how to get around, you're going to be using your phone a lot more, trying to figure out where's the nearest restaurant, than if you're a local that may not need to interact with their phone to determine how to get around town. That's just one very basic, simple example. But because of those differences in usage patterns, when we're comparing locals and visitors, we can't just look at raw counts, because it will end up skewing in one direction or another because of this shift in foreground and background. And so we have to be more nuanced in terms of our analysis and looking at devices to be able to account for some of those nuances in local behavior versus visitor behavior before we jump to a conclusion by just looking at the raw data itself. So yes, it's possible, but we would caveat anyone who's doing these types of studies, make sure you account for some of these differences in behaviors before you jump to the conclusion that it was all locals or all visitors.
Kelby, we have another question from Babette over at State of Kansas. Do you have a percentage of users that are opting out of sharing?
Yeah, so this is interesting. There's a number of studies that we have referenced in addition to just what we observe in the feeds. And it's not, well, stepping back a little bit, when iOS 14.5 came out, that was really what kind of started this cascade of sharing and the differences. There were a lot of folks that said, opt-in rates are going to be low single digits. And so there were some, I think, on the, some privacy advocates that were hoping that the geolocation industry would collapse, but it didn't happen. And the reason why is there's so much value that people get from having the ability to look up the weather in real time, restaurants that are near them in real time. So location sharing across different apps remained, I think people opted in at a whole lot higher than Apple anticipated. But one thing that is nuanced is it varies widely based on app. So if you're playing, some type of a gaming app, and there's not really a legitimate reason for them to know your location, people are opting out at a very high rate. But if it's a utility app or some type of a productivity app that has a legitimate purpose of needing to know where you are, those opt-in rates have been as high as 80+%. But this comes back to that question at the beginning. Instead of having kind of this homogeneous opt-in, opt-out rate, now we have the potential for a lot of skew, because certain apps will have a really high opt-in rate, other apps will have a low opt-in rate, but we want to have a good mix of all types of apps. So overall, when we're looking at opt-in rates, one of the things we look at is in comparison to the overall destination. And so in most cases, in most given days, we have between 6 to 12% of a population represented, but it will vary widely by a lot of different for a lot of different reasons.
I don't see any more questions unless somebody wants to throw one in there. I've got my email up on this slide. If anybody wants to reach out and chat, I am more than happy to say hello and just hear what's going on.